Welcome, everybody, to Composting 101. So I am Dean Gunderson, the Director of Education here at Seed St. Louis. So here at Seed St. Louis, we are a nonprofit that works in the St. Louis region to help people to grow their own food, basically. So we do that in a lot of different ways. And if you're a community group or interested in any of those other things, please check out our website, or you can ask questions at the end. Yeah, one of the ways that we help people is we teach these classes that are free because of all of our generous funders. So today, though, we're going to be talking about composting 101, just some basics about composting, what it is, how to do it, different ways to go about it, what is and is not compostable, all that fun stuff. So let's dive right in. So first, what is compost? So compost is, to oversimplify it just a little, is basically just decomposed organic material. So organic material is anything that used to be alive. So like from a chemistry standpoint, organic. And it's just organic material that has broken down, been decomposed. So composting is just composting, as an ing, is just the process of decomposition that leads to compost. Compost is the finished product. This is a process that is done by aerobic bacteria and fungi primarily. And aerobic just means in an oxygen-rich environment. So like we are aerobic organisms as human beings. We need like an oxygen-rich environment. But there are some microorganisms that don't like a lot of oxygen. So like the microorganisms that live in your intestines don't like a lot of oxygen, which is why they can survive in there. So to compost, that composting process, what you need for it is basically things to feed and keep those bacteria and fungi happy. And that is essentially food, which is the organic material, water, and oxygen. And so on the other end, decomposition that happens with limited or very small to no oxygen is either fermentation or putrefaction or putrefaction. So like when stuff is putrid, that like kind of rotting like meat smell, like that's putrefaction. So we don't really like that. That's not really composting. So composting is, again, that aerobic environment. So lots of oxygen. And in that system, if you're keeping lots of oxygen and it is the aerobic organisms breaking down that organic matter, it will not stink. That's that nasty smell that sometimes people get when they think they're composting. That is when there is not enough oxygen and the anaerobic, or the organisms that do not like oxygen, have taken over and are causing fermentation and putrefaction. So one thing that I always like to point out is composting, again, the process of it happens. Whether you want it to or not, it's going to happen. All organic matter decomposes eventually. And, thank goodness it does, or we would all be buried in, a mile-high mound of dead plants and animals. Things decompose without human intervention. So when people discuss composting, they are talking about creating a setup that optimizes the composting process. So again, that like microorganism breaking down material and allowing it to be collected in order to be used. Like that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about composting. So again, like this material will break down without us doing anything, but composting is a way for us to control that for one of many reasons, and generally with the goal of then getting compost at the end, because we like compost for reasons that we'll talk about. So why compost? Like why do it? If it's going to happen anyways, why do it? And one of the big reasons is that you get compost from it. And compost is a great soil amendment. It's kind of a jack of all trades when it comes to improving and enriching your soil. It moderates water in soil. So although it sounds ridiculous, it both increases drainage and increases how much water your soil can hold simultaneously. It acts like a sponge. And so like a sponge, it's got, big kind of pore spaces in it, but can also hold on to a lot of water. And so it's a great way to increase kind of the water efficiency of your garden. It reduces runoff. It, does great things in terms of water management in your soil. It also increases aeration because again, it's kind of like a sponge. So it helps keep your soil fluffier, which increases the amount of oxygen in your soil, which is also good for plants because plants are also aerobic organisms. Plants don't want a low oxygen environment. It also increases organic matter because compost is 100% organic matter. So if you're adding compost to your soil, you are adding organic matter. And organic matter is that black, rich material that that is where a lot of the nutrients, so not the minerals, but a lot of the nutrients and the more like more mobile mineral or like the more mobile nutrients like nitrogen and stuff are going to be in compost. Compost is also really high in phosphorus for the most part. It's just a good way to add a lot of materials to your soil. So it's kind of like a low grade fertilizer. And the other big one that has not gotten as much attention until recently, but might in fact be one of the biggest things that it does, is that it feeds soil life. So organic matter is also the food that the beneficial microorganisms, so your bacteria, your fungi, your protozoa, nematodes, microarthropods, all those things are consuming when there is not food coming from a plant. So that'll be any time that your soil does not have an actively growing plant in it, whether that's because it's winter or you're between crops or any of those times. If there's not a plant actively growing, those microorganisms need another source of food, which can be compost, or if there's not organic matter or compost in the soil and there are not plants, those microorganisms just die. And then they're not going to be around to be helping your plants when you plant them. So having compost is really nice. It's also on kind of, a different slant to it. And another reason why a lot of people compost is it is the single most impactful thing you can do to reduce your household waste. If you look, nearly 40% of food in the United States is never eaten. It's thrown away, it's composted, it's left to rot. 40%. And by weight, 61% of all municipal solid waste is a compostable material. And this is before recycling. So that includes, paper, paperboard, wood, food scraps, yard trimmings. 61% of all of the waste that we are producing as everyday citizens is stuff that could be composted. So, paper and stuff like that, we should recycle it if recycling was available to us. But other things, really the primary way to recycle it is composting. And because of that, when you are looking at just what's going to landfills, so once you kind of take out, people are recycling a lot of paper, thank goodness. And so when you look at what's actually going to landfills, 24% of the volume of landfills is food that we didn't eat. That's wild. And so, if we can compost that, if we can divert that from a landfill, that's great. Because then our landfills would reduce by 25%. There'd be fewer trucks, all of that. And it is also, there's a little glitch for me. Yeah, and then paper and paper products make up about 11% of landfill volume. So there's still paper and paper products that are not getting recycled. And some of that is because there's paper products that cannot be recycled. If you have, paper or cardboard or something like that gets grease on it or food waste in some way, they won't recycle it, but you can still compost it. Or, coffee filters that are made of paper or paper napkins, all of those things are paper products that end up in a landfill, but are compostable. And so a lot of the waste that we do could be composted. And when it ends up at a landfill, it turns into methane. And some of that methane is captured at landfills because landfills are inherently anaerobic environments. So they are not composting in a landfill. Landfills will not compost because there's not enough oxygen. So when you break down and there's not oxygen available, the bacteria that are breaking down all of that food, that 24, with the paper products, the 35% of landfill volume, so more than a third of landfill volume is being broken down by anaerobic organisms. And when they do that, they produce methane. And about 11% of all methane on the planet is coming from landfills. And again, that's only coming from food, paper products, yard waste, like those compostable things. And methane is currently responsible for 30% of all global temperature rises that have happened since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And so, CO2 gets all the attention, and there's good reason for that. But 30% of our heating is from methane, and 11% of all of the methane is coming from food that we're not eating and we're just throwing away. And so if we compost it instead, we could avoid some of that. And at the end of it, we get this amazing soil amendment that makes your plants grow better. So when we're talking about composting, there are lots of different ways to do it. So, assuming you all want to compost because you're here, there's different ways to do it. I did have a poll that I wanted to do just out of curiosity here, and I'm going to launch it. So hopefully you'll see it pop up for you. And it's just a question of whether you're composting or not currently. Because we're going to talk about a couple different ways to compost. And so I'm just kind of interested to hear what people are doing. Zoom is also being, whoop, there we go. Okay. Seeing some still coming in, but it looks like it's about 50-50 so far. I don't know if everybody can see that. But yeah, so it's almost exactly 50-50 between people who are and people who are not composting. So that's pretty cool. So yeah, so for those who are composting, you might already, have a way that you're doing it. To those who are not composting, you are probably still open or thinking about what you're going to do, which is great. So I'll talk about kind of the pros and cons of a couple different ways to do it. Sorry, my Zoom's being real weird here. The poll is blocking my. All right, you have to give me a second here. Sorry about this. The poll just completely blocked my view, so I couldn't read any of my slides. But we are back in business. All right, so since half of you are not currently composting and are potentially looking for your preferred way to do it, we'll talk about the different styles. So one is just what I kind of call composting in place or mulch. So for food waste, this doesn't work as well because most of us don't want to just throw food waste all over our backyard for many good reasons. But this is a way, especially for yard waste, that you can just kind of use it as mulch. If you have leaves, you can chop them up. If you have weeds, you can just kind of lay them down on the soil surface. And they will just kind of break down on their own. And then you get kind of mulch that eventually will turn into compost. So that is one way to do it. And it's how, it happens in the wild, as it were. But assuming you want to do, food waste and maybe not have just random stuff all over the place, a pile is the kind of classic way to do it, and is definitely the lowest tech, cheapest way to do it. And it's literally just throwing it all in a pile. And then you're going to manage that pile in ways that we'll talk about going forward. But that's one way. And that was how my grandpa did it. There's also bins, which are probably the most common way to do it, I would say. So a bin is basically just a pile with walls. So it looks a little cleaner, looks a little more intentional. And you can have either a single bin, which is again just kind of an enclosed space with walls, or you can have a multi-bin. So that's one where a lot of times you'll have a little cube or something that's enclosed, and then you'll have another one next to it, and then maybe another one next to it, and you kind of move stuff from one bin to the other. And that's the one that we'll talk about probably the most because that's the most common. There's also tumbling composters. So tumbling composters, I would say, are probably the best if you are looking at pretty much just doing food waste. If you're not really a gardener, if you're just looking at I've got some food waste, I want to compost it. Maybe a little bit of yard waste here and there. but mostly food waste. And you're in a situation where maybe, you know, a bin or a pile or something where it's more out in the open doesn't really work, either for aesthetic reasons or, you know, neighbors complaining, or you have really high um, populations of rodents or stuff like that that could potentially be a problem getting into the compost bin. Tumbling composters are really nice in that instance because they're fully enclosed. So this is just one style here where it's like a fully enclosed bin. You take this top off, you throw whatever you're going to compost in it, put the lid back on, and then you tumble it. You kind of like pull it, you know, it'll turn end over end. More often you'll see them where they'll turn on the other axis. So they'll kind of, you know, turn this way as opposed to like tumbling end over end. But there's various ways to do that. So again, those are nice because they're like fully enclosed. You know, rodents and stuff cannot get into it. That's, you know, that's not going to be a problem. That's currently what I have at my apartment, where I'm just doing food scraps, and then where my garden and everything is, I have more of like a bin or pile where it's, you know, most, you know, yard waste and weeds and stuff like that, where, you know, you're not going to have as many problems with rodents or, you know, people complaining about stuff because it's not, you know, just like a random banana peel or something sticking out. There's also a type of composting called bokashi. So bokashi is kind of it's an odd way to do it, or it's a unique way to do it. It's different than any other way. And the bokashi is not in and of itself necessarily a composting system. It's basically where you are buying an inoculant to ferment your food waste and then you're composting it. So kind of the benefit of bokashi, or why some people like bokashi, is that because you are kind of fermenting it ahead of time, it can be easier to compost things like animal products, things like meat or dairy or eggs or stuff like that. It can be a little simpler to compost those things than it is in some of these other systems. But when you but it's not in and of itself a composting system. So you're kind of like putting stuff in a bucket and you're adding all this inoculant, and then you're adding like paper and stuff on top. And once the bucket is full, you then have to do something with it because it doesn't actually break down into compost in that bucket. So like once the bucket's full, you then have to either put it in a pile or a bin or a tumbling composter to actually compost it. Or often what they recommend doing is you dig like a big old trench and then you bury it, which that's kind of cool, but also then like you gotta dig a big old trench every time you have a full bucket, and that's a lot of work. And in the winter, how do you do that? Like the ground's frozen, like you can't really do that. And so not to like bash on bokashi, I think it's an interesting way to do it. And I know people who really like bokashi, but it's kind of a little it's a different situation than most other composting, and not what most people kind of assume it is at first glance. There's also vermicomposting, which we'll also touch on at the end, because it's another one that I think is really nice for especially people who don't have a lot of outside space. So if you're like in an apartment, or you're in, you know, like more of a high-rise building or something where you don't have a yard at all, or a place to like really do, you know, a tumbling compost or a bin, a pile or something like that, you can still compost your food waste using vermicomposting. You can do vermicomposting like in your kitchen, and if you're doing it appropriately, it's not going to stink, it's not going to cause, you know, insect problems or anything like that. And so vermicomposting is another one that we'll talk about. And then there is also electrical composting. So this is increasingly, there's companies making like appliances that you can compost with, and those are kind of cool, but they're all pretty expensive, and I don't know, there's easier ways to do it, or much cheaper ways to do it, but that is another option. So bins, so this is, you know, kind of an idea of a bin. There's different ways to do it. You can be made out of anything, you know, from chicken wire, concrete blocks, wood, pallets, you know, bricks. Just it's just got to be something with walls. So it can be kind of a bin like in this sense, where you're just kind of making like a ring and you're piling stuff into it. Or you can have like a multi-bin like this, where you've got kind of these more corral structures, and you just kind of pile stuff in this corral and like move it from bin to bin. You can have, like I said, one bin or multiple bins. So if you have a single bin, kind of not like the limitation to that is that if, you know, especially if you're doing food waste, where you're, you know, I assume you eat every week. So, you know, you're adding, you know, food scraps every week, then at some point this bin is going to be full, but you're going to have some stuff that you just added last week and some stuff that you added 2 years ago that's fully composted. And then separating that is kind of a pain. Whereas with a multi-bin system, what you can do is you will only add stuff, like new stuff, to this first bin. And you add. And when it's full, you just with a shovel or a pitchfork or something, you pick all that stuff up and move it to the next bin. And then you just continue to add stuff. And when this first bin is full again, then you move everything that's in bin 2 to bin 3, everything from bin 1 to bin 2, and repeat and fill this third one again, fill. And when this third one is full, or this first one is full the third time, then the stuff in this third bin should be fully composted for you. And then you take that out, you use it, and then you repeat. You add bin 2 to bin 3, bin 1 to bin 2, and then you continue to add stuff to bin 1. So it kind of allows you to keep adding stuff while also allowing the composting process to work its way all the way through without having to separate out half-rotten banana peels from fully composted stuff. Generally, if you're going to do a bin, kind of a 3-foot cube is a nice size. So 1 cubic yard is kind of a good size. You can kind of do the same, or a 3-foot diameter, ring. About that is kind of the smallest size where you'll get good heat and stuff going on, where the composting will happen faster. If you go a lot smaller than that, the composting will still happen, but it's going to happen more slowly. So just if you're thinking about size, kind of 3-foot cube is good. So then another thing that I'm going to touch on is the idea of greens and browns. So if you have composted before, I'm sure you've heard these terms before. If you have not composted and you're just trying to figure it out, if you've dove into reading about composting at all, I'm sure you've seen lots of stuff about greens and browns, and it gets really overwhelming and totally unnecessary in a lot of ways. And people will argue about well, is this a green or a brown? And they'll debate about it. And at the end of the day, who cares? It really doesn't actually matter that much. It's good to know the concepts and kind of what they mean. But worrying about oh, is this specific thing a green or a brown? At the end of the day, it's not that important. So don't fret about all those little details. They're for what most of us are trying to do with composting, doesn't really matter. But generally speaking, greens are things that are high in nitrogen. And the reason that they're called greens is that greens are pretty much always plants that were cut when they were green. So things that were severed from the plant or ripped out of the ground when the plant was still alive and actively growing. So this would be if you're ripping out weeds, or food scraps are green because you're not eating dry dead leaves. You're eating lettuce or celery stalks or things that were kind of alive, full of water and green. And this would include, again, fruits and vegetables, weeds, coffee grounds, even though they are brown, those do actually count as greens, and grass clippings are all going to be greens. Browns, on the other hand, are things, so high in carbon is what that should say. And carbon is, for the most part, brown. So browns are plants that died on their own and then were collected. So this would be things like dead plants. So in the winter, you get a frost, all your tomatoes die and turn brown and crispy. Those are then browns. Paper products are browns. They're mostly wood. Browns tend to be high in cellulose, lignin, woody type products. Eggshells, although they are kind of a weird one, those would be considered a brown. And then hair, which also sounds weird, but if you have pets and you got a bunch of dog hair or whatever, or you cut your own hair or something, hair can be composted, and that would also be a brown. So kind of like I was saying, greens and browns doesn't matter. So for vermicomposting specifically, it is important to know. For other forms of composting, you'll find a lot of stuff where they're oh, you have to have a 2-to-1 ratio, or you need to layer stuff this way, and talking about all these very precise things, and you don't need that. Especially when you're talking about food scraps that you're adding all the time, it's just not really feasible to get those exact ratios. And even when you're talking about those ratios, are those ratios by volume? Are they by weight? Is it by weight when they're wet? Is it by volume when they're wet? Is it by, if the greens are wet, which usually they are, and the browns are dry, does that work? Or do you need to make the browns wet to measure the weight or the volume? Like those ratios, like they're general ideas. You don't need to, like, again, fret about them too much, because you're not running a big commercial composting operation, I assume. In those systems, sometimes knowing those ratios is a little more important. But for your backyard composting, you don't need to know that much. But knowing the idea of greens and browns can be helpful to troubleshoot if you have problems. Because there's some times where you're like, I'm having this problem, and it could mean that you just need to add some browns. And we'll talk about kind of how you know that, but there's things like that can happen. And so a couple things to know is that greens, so the things that are high in nitrogen, feed bacteria. Browns feed fungi. So generally speaking, the more greens that you have in your compost pile, the faster the composting, because bacteria grow much faster. Bacteria can multiply every 20 minutes. So they can multiply much faster. They're eating stuff much faster. The composting happens more quickly. But all of that extra, multiplying and eating and breathe, like respirating, they don't have like lungs in the way that we do, but like they're taking in oxygen, releasing CO2. The more greens you have, generally the faster the bacteria are reproducing. That also means that the faster oxygen is being used, and oxygen is getting depleted faster. So what that means is if you have something that is like a lot of greens and not a lot of browns, that's a lot of times when you run into the like, oh, it stinks, or it's, getting that nasty smell. And that's simply because it's the bacteria are growing so fast, they're depleting oxygen. And so you just need to get more oxygen in there. And so there's a couple ways to do that. One, you could add more browns, which will slow down the process. And that can help. And that can be, you can do multiple things. That can be one way to do it. You can also just turn it. Like that's like part of why we turn compost, which we'll talk about. Like if you're in a tumbler, you just turn it, or if it's in a bin, you just take a shovel or something and you just kind of like pick it up and literally like kind of turn it, like, pick up a shovel, flip it upside down, pick up a shovelful, flip it upside down. Like that's turning. And that's that turning. Literally, you're taking the stuff on the inside of the pile where the oxygen is most depleted, and you're flipping it upside down and throwing it out here where there's lots of oxygen. And so that can be a way to do it. Or you can also do what's called making chimneys. So if you've got like a big pile and you don't want to like turn the whole thing, you can take like a broomstick or something and just like poke it through and make just like holes in it. And that's going to help oxygen diffuse deeper into the pile more quickly. So there's just a couple things that you can do. And again, and that's where like just knowing the difference between greens and browns can kind of tell you that. So if you know, oh, it's all food waste and my pile is getting kind of stinky, then you know that's probably because it's depleting oxygen. And so you need to either turn it or add some browns to slow down the process so the oxygen isn't being depleted as quickly, or make some chimneys. But you don't need to be like, oh no, I only have a 1-to-1 ratio instead of a 2-to-1 ratio. Like that, like, don't stress about that. So what actually to compost? So this is another thing that you'll find all sorts of people debate, like what is and is not compostable. So technically, anything that used to be alive can compost. Like full stop. Like that is possible. But what you actually put in your compost bin, more so than is it possible or not, depends on your goals, limitations, and what system you're using to some extent. So just as an example, meat and dairy, generally, and eggs, generally, people don't want to add to their piles because it can be a little tricky. They can go anaerobic more quickly, which means they can get stinky more quickly. And especially if you have a lot of animals, like pest type animals, and or it's not enclosed or turned regularly, it can get really smelly and it can attract rodents and raccoons and stuff like that. And so a lot of times people just don't compost those things, but technically they are compostable. And so so yeah, it really kind of depends more on what it is you're wanting to do and how comfortable you are with it. If you know I'm not going to turn this pretty regularly, then yeah, definitely don't do meat or dairy or eggs. But if you're like, I know what I'm doing. I'm out there every day taking care of it or whatever, and you want to try doing those things, give it a shot. Um, and if it starts, and do a little bit, don't like start throwing in large amounts of stuff. But you can throw in a little bit. And also, if you're throwing away large amounts of meat, what is happening at your house? Like, I mean, for the most part, I imagine you're eating most of the meat, and then it's just like weird little scraps here and there. So usually, it's not a whole lot that you're throwing in. And like just as another example, worms, like if you're doing vermicomposting, worms generally don't like citrus or stuff in the onion family. So onions, garlic, leeks, stuff like that. It's not necessarily going to like poison them, but they're not going to break it down. And so it can then rot or get nasty in the vermicompost bin. So generally it's best to just not add those things so that you don't run into issues of odors or flies or stuff like that growing. But generally speaking, I would say, especially if you're like just starting out or you're like wanting to figure out how to do it, the best like starting point and what the majority of people who compost kind of limit themselves to is fruit and vegetable scraps. So any, plant material left over from your cooking can go in there. Weeds. And with weeds, I would say if you have a weed that's really invasive or really hard to manage, you generally don't want to add it, especially if it has seeds on it, or if it's a rhizomatous weed. So if it's something like Bermuda grass, don't throw a bunch of the like big long rhizomes of Bermuda grass in your compost bin, because the composting is not going to kill it. At least backyard composting is not going to kill it. And so then you're just going to be throwing Bermuda grass all over your garden. But especially if you're ripping out stuff, there's no seeds on it. They're not like big, long, perennial, root weed type things. Like that's all compostable. Garden plants are all compostable. A lot of people don't like to compost garden plants that had disease problems. So, if you had a tomato that had really awful blight or something like that, it's usually best to not compost that, just because if your compost is not getting real hot, which is most often the case in backyard composting, usually your compost is not getting really hot, which is really a good thing because you don't have to worry about it getting so hot that it catches fire, which is a thing that can happen in large scale composting. But because you're not getting that hot, the blight won't necessarily be killed in the composting process. And so, if you've got some really nasty disease on a plant, usually don't compost those. Throw those in the yard waste bin or something like that. Tree leaves, like all the leaves that you rake up from your yard, excellent in the compost bin. Also, my absolute favorite mulch are dead tree leaves. Grass clippings can also work. I would say with grass clippings, the trick is if you get those like big bags where it's all wet and it's like matted together, that stuff gets nasty. So that's a little harder to compost because it goes anaerobic and it starts stinking and it's nasty. So really kind of the best grass clippings is if like you mow and you don't bag them and then you kind of like rake them up later, like when they're dry, and then throw those in the compost. That's really generally the easiest way to compost grass clippings. Or if you collect them in that bag, to kind of lay it out, like kind of break it up and lay it out to let it dry, and then throwing it in and mixing it in with your compost is usually the best way to do grass clippings. And then also you don't really want to be doing grass clippings if they were sprayed with something. If your grass clippings were sprayed with a broadleaf herbicide to kill clover or something, and you throw it in your compost, the composting isn't necessarily going to break that down. And if you then put it on your garden, it's going to kill all of your broadleaf vegetables, which is basically all of them except for onions. So you want to make sure that if you're using grass clippings, they're grass clippings that are clean, that are not sprayed with any sort of chemical that you wouldn't want to add to your garden. Eggshells also, very easy, great source of calcium for your garden. Like I said, hair, pet hair, cut your own hair, whatever, and then coffee grounds. And those are kind of the easiest ones to do. But there are other things that are compostable, again, theoretically, and depending on how comfortable you are. Just to dispel some myths here, cooked food, you can compost cooked food. Again, if you're composting a whole bunch of cooked food, it's going to be harder than if you're just like adding in little bits here and there that are like waste from your plate. That's much easier to do than if you're like, oh, this whole casserole went bad, and then you dump it in. Like that's going to have more of a chance of going anaerobic, of being stinky, of having issues in your compost. But if you're just scraping your plate, it's probably fine. Grains, bread, etc. So like, if you've got some extra rice or, a couple pieces of bread at the end of the loaf went moldy, you can throw those in the compost. That's fine. Rotten food, again, if the food's like real nasty and you've got a lot of it, throwing it in there might not be a great idea because it's got more chance of being stinky because it's already stinky. But if you've got food that's like, oh, this is a little past prime, I don't really want to eat this, but it's not like full of mold and slimy, put it in there. It's probably going to be fine. And again, small amounts of dairy and or animal products. Paper is compostable. Glossy paper is a little not ideal. It doesn't compost real easily. But newspaper, brown paper, printer paper, that'll all compost. Paper napkins, paper towels, coffee filters, stuff like that. Technically natural fiber fabric, although really there's almost no fabric that we have that is truly natural fiber anymore. Like they don't even really sell thread that isn't polyester anymore. So if there's like any stitching in your clothes, even if it says 100% cotton, it's still got polyester thread in it. And the dyes that we use aren't natural. And so that one's like technically you could, but it's kind of hard in practice. Wood ashes can go into your compost. Again, in relatively small amounts. Don't be dumping like, a 5-gallon bucket into like a tumbling composter. But if you've got just like a little bit of wood ash here and there, or a little bit of, charcoal. And when I say ashes, I'm talking about like through wood ash. So not like charcoal briquettes, like the ashes from those. That is actually made from coal and is toxic. So don't use that. But if it's like actual, like just like wood that you burned, those ashes can be added. Manure from herbivores. So you won't be adding, cat or dog feces. Don't do that. But if you've got horses around or chickens or things like that, you can add those. Chicken bedding works pretty well. So like in our chicken coop, we add a lot of straw. They poop in the straw and then we rake it all out together. That composts. Like I said, pet hair, actually nail clippings can go in. And then this is a weird one, but and it's like real specific, but there's certain packing peanuts now that are made out of starch. Like, and you can tell because if you just like put it in water, it dissolves. Those are like 100% starch, and those can also be composted. It's really kind of the only plastic that can be truly like in a backyard situation. But there are those like starch packing peanuts that you'll find every once in a while. So what not to compost? So there are things that you should not compost that aren't like super intuitive that you might think you can compost, or you'll find things online that say that you can compost that I hard disagree with. So one is dryer lint. If you take dryer lint and you put it in your compost, it will probably disappear. But again, virtually all of our clothing now is made of plastic. It's virtually everything you wear is made of petroleum. And so your lint is essentially a big old ball of microplastics. And so if you throw that in your compost, it will disappear, but it's just those microplastics are falling into their individual little microplastics. And then you're just adding plastic all over in your garden. So again, unless your clothes are all 100% cotton or 100% linen or 100% silk, which again is almost impossible. They don't even sell underwear or socks that don't have synthetics in them. But if somehow you do, you could technically add that dryer lint, but I wouldn't recommend adding dryer lint. Disposable plastic and paper products that say compostable are generally not compostable. Almost all the time you will see it'll say compostable, and then there'll be a little asterisk, and then in tiny print in the back it'll say in an industrial composting facility. And your backyard is not an industrial composting facility, and it will not decompose. Tea bags, I think there's one tea company, and I can't remember its name now, but virtually all tea bags are made from, again, plastic. Like the threads are synthetic fibers. And so if you throw that in your compost, if it disappears, it's just breaking into microplastics. You can like rip the tea bag open and dump the leaves into your compost. Like the leaves are perfectly compostable. Or if you do loose leaf tea, like the tea leaves are fully compostable, but the bag itself is made out of synthetics. Plant material, yeah, I mentioned this already, but plant material that has been treated with herbicides, don't add that, because the herbicides are probably not going to fully break down, if at all, in your compost. Treated wood, don't add that. And like I said, ashes from charcoal briquettes, and then human waste or manure from any meat-eating animal. So that's your dogs, your cats, stuff like that. You will find, and this is not super common in the US, but like if you see stuff is like, I am not a plastic cup, 100% compostable, 100% biodegradable. And it says here, like this tumbler is made from plant starch and can be turned to compost to help grow more crops. So even something like that, like you could try it, but there's a good chance that again, in a backyard compost, it's not really going to work. There's a few things, and you have to kind of like look. There's some that like PILA cases, those like phone cases, like they actually like specifically say that they've like tested them like in backyard compost situations. And so like there's some things like that you can find where they'll specifically say that it can work in a backyard. And if that's the case, give it a shot. But if it's just something that says 100% compostable, but it's like holding a liquid, like it's a plastic. And so to actually break down, it needs a pretty high temperature that you're just for the most part not going to get in a backyard composting situation. So a couple things to know then, if like when you're actually building your compost or you're using it, a couple kind of useful things to know is one is placement. So ideally you're going to put your compost bin or your tumbler or your pile or whatever you're wanting to do somewhere that is in the shade and is convenient. And I always like to emphasize that convenient. If you're like, oh, the only shade I have is way out in the back and I like can't see it. Well, if that means you're not going to use it all that often, then put it somewhere else. You want it somewhere where you're gonna use it, where you're gonna notice it, where you're gonna remember to do it. And if that is not somewhere that is in the ideal shaded situation, so be it. But if you have options somewhere that is in the shade and is also convenient to you. And one of the reasons that the shade is helpful is that temperature is really important to the composting process. The speed of composting varies enormously depending on the temperature. It is the fastest when temperatures are comfortable to people. So like spring and summer, like when it's like a nice temperature outside, that's when your stuff is going to break down and compost really quickly. When it gets really hot in the summer, it's going to slow down. And that's why if you're in the shade in the summer, it's going to compost for a longer period in the summer. But then when it's below freezing, it's not happening at all. Because if the water is frozen, the bacteria, the fungi can't get that water. And so they're not going to be composting. And so if it's really cold outside, it's also going to slow down a lot. And so you'll notice as you're adding stuff to your pile that you're going to add stuff in the spring and it's going to be breaking down really, really pretty quickly. But by the time that you get to like late fall and it's cooling down, you're going to be adding stuff. And you're going to notice that like every time you get there, the compost bin is just a little fuller because it's not breaking down as much. And a lot of times by like early spring, you're like, oh my gosh, there's so much stuff in here and it's not breaking down. Like, what is happening? And then when the weather gets nice, it'll break down really quick. And so that temperature is really critical, and it's gonna vary that speed of composting pretty drastically. Also, size is important. So the material that you are putting into the bin, the smaller the pieces, the faster they will compost. Because again, that material needs to be basically eaten by bacteria and fungi, little itty bitty things. So the more surface area you have, the smaller the pieces, the faster that they can break it down. And so if you have like, oh, I've got this big old tomato plant and you just shove the whole thing into your compost bin, that is not going to break down as much as if you like run over it with a lawnmower and then rake up the little bits and throw it in there, or you just even, chop it up a little bit or just break it into some smaller pieces. Just doing that, especially with big stuff, is going to help your composting happen more quickly. And if you have a lot of big stuff like corn stuff, like I grow a lot of like popcorn, and that's the one thing that like I will cut them all down and I'll throw them in a big heap and I will like drive over them with the lawnmower to like chop them up, and then I'll throw them all in the compost bin. Because if you just throw a bunch of full dry corn stalks in a pile, they'll be there for well over a year before they break down really at all because they're just this big mass of material, versus if you cut them up, they're going to break down in a matter of months. So management. You can add materials to your compost bin whenever you want. because again, you don't need to worry that much about ratios. If you really want to do like, oh, I need a specific ratio, then it gets a little tricky because sometimes you need to like build up enough brown so that you can add some more greens or something like that. But if you're not worried about that, which I don't think you need to be, then just add them as you need to. If the bin looks dry, like if you look in there and it's like it's dry, like it's like the material is not wet, then it's not going to compost because those bacteria, the fungi, they need water just like we do. And so if it's dry, add some water. In a tumbling composter, they don't dry out that fast. But if you're like in a bin or a pile where it's, just completely open to the air, especially in the summer when it's pretty hot, your pile can dry out. And so like just, watering it a little bit, just like you would your vegetable garden, is actually going to help the composting process speed up a little bit for you, especially in those warmer months. And then, like I've mentioned a couple times, if there's any off smells or composting is happening pretty slowly, you can turn the bin. So that's just aerating that compost. And there's several different ways to do that. One is you can just use like a digging fork or a shovel and literally just, stick it in there and like turn the material. Or one thing that I kind of like is they make these little tools and you can just buy them like on Amazon. There might be some nurseries that carry them, although I haven't seen them consistently. But what it is it's got these two handles you hold and this big long pole that goes down, and then it's got these two little wings. So these wings are bent in such a way that when you push down with the spike, like you push it into your compost bin, those wings fold up. And so they go down, and then when you pull, and when you go to pull it back up, those wings open, and so they kind of rip the material out. So it kind of helps to turn it. And so you just kind of like, stick it in, pull it out, stick it in, pull it out, and you kind of do that throughout the pile. And it helps kind of, one, poke some small chimneys like we talked about, and also kind of pull some of that material from the middle to the outside to aerate a little bit. So that's another tool that you can use to turn, or if you're in a tumbling composter, just literally, tumble it or turn it. And there's, I think I said in here, there is no set schedule of how often to turn. It depends on how hot it is, how cold it is, how many greens are in your compost bin. So I would say there's generally no such thing as turning too much. Like I know people who turn every day, which is maybe a little excessive, but like it'll still compost, it'll still work. It's really more kind of getting those cues. So, if you're noticing smells, like if you're turning it and every time you go to turn it, it smells, you probably need to turn it more often. And then, maybe, if it's been a week since you did it, maybe try 5 days. And if it, still smells after 5 days, maybe do 4 days or 3 days, and you can kind of play with it. But again, it's going to vary. Like in the spring and the fall, when the bacteria and the fungi are growing the fastest, you're going to need to turn more often. If it's been 0 degrees for a week, you don't need to turn at all because nothing's happening at that point. So, and then harvest. So you want to actually get the compost, or at the very least, eventually you're going to need to empty your compost bin so you can keep adding stuff to compost. If you have a single bin or a tumbler, like I mentioned earlier, your bin will be filled with material in all different states of decomposition. So you will either need to stop adding material long enough for everything in the bin or the tumbling composter to fully compost, which is kind of hard to do because then what do you do with all it? Do you just like throw it in the trash for a couple months and then start composting again? Like it gets a little tricky. Or you can screen the material. So what that is you just have like literally like a screen. You can get like a 2x4 box and then put hardware cloth, it's called. You can get them just like at any hardware store. And it's this heavy duty screen that's about a 1/4 inch square on it. And you just shovel out of your pile or your tumbling composter or whatever onto the screen. And then you just kind of rub your hand with a glove over it. And the finished compost will fall through the screen. And the stuff that is not fully compost will be stuck on top. And so as you're doing that, I like to do that over a wheelbarrow because then all the compost will fall into the wheelbarrow. And then I just take all the stuff that's not composted and I throw it in a pile. And then once I empty everything, I then have a wheelbarrow full of compost that I can go do with as I please. And then all the stuff that's not fully composted, I throw back into the bin. So vermicomposting is a bit different, which is why I wanted to talk about this one separate. And it's just a couple slides here. And vermicomposting, again, is simply composting using worms, and is a great way to compost inside. It creates a very bacterially diverse compost, which is nice. Diversity is good. And there are lots of different bin options. There are many for sale and a lot of plans online. All of them that I've seen should work. Like I haven't seen any that I'm like, wow, that's just a scam, because it's not all that complicated. But I would say that stacking systems are my favorite because they are the easiest to harvest. And that would be something kind of like this, where you have bins that like sit on top of each other, are easier than just like one big bin like this in terms of harvest. So for vermicomposting, you can feed them just about anything that you would compost other ways. So, especially like, your kitchen scraps, eggshells, stuff like that can go in there. They do not like I mentioned earlier, citrus or things in the onion family, and they also don't like animal products for the most part. So those are no-go for vermicomposting. And unlike with the other type of composting, you do need a good mix of greens and what is often referred to as bedding in vermicomposting. And bedding is just browns. The most common is shredded paper, but you could also use like dried leaves or something like that, or straw or something like that. And you want it at roughly a 1-to-1 ratio. And I think that that's generally like a 1-to-1 by weight. And part of that is because those browns, which are dry, are going to help soak up the liquid from the greens as they're breaking down so that it doesn't go anaerobic. So you're adding in, some vegetable scraps, and then you're adding a bunch of like dry brown material, whether that's, again, paper or straw or, dried leaves or something like that on top of it to help soak up moisture. If you just have greens, there isn't enough oxygen in the system, and the worms will crawl out of the bin or die. So if you've done vermicomposting and the worms keep crawling out, it's probably because there's not enough oxygen in there. And so what you need to do is to be adding more bedding or more browns. And like I said, the best bedding options are shredded paper. You can also do coir. That's a thing that is really popular. You have to pay for it, which is kind of annoying. Like you have to like buy it as bedding, and you can just use shredded paper. So I really prefer shredded paper. But coir is another material that you can buy that makes a really nice bedding material. And then using your compost. So you can just apply it to the soil surface. You don't need to till it into the soil. Worms will essentially till it for you. They come up to the surface, they'll eat it, and then they'll go back down into the soil and poop it out. So the worms will kind of till it in for you eventually. I like to apply it before or right after I broad fork the soil, or use a digging fork to kind of loosen up the soil a little bit. And then the compost kind of falls into the gaps and you get more of a smoother surface, and it kind of gets the compost down deeper for you without actually tilling. It can also be good to add just a handful when you plant a seedling. So like if you dig a hole for your tomato, you can throw a little bit of compost in the hole and then stick the plant on top of it. You can also make an extract, which is just where you like kind of stick compost in a bag, and then you just kind of rub it with your hands, and it makes this like nice brown liquid. And that extract you can spray onto the soil, you can spray it onto leaves, you can spray it onto seeds, or you can use it as the liquid that you soak your seeds with if you soak your seeds. And then compost can be used as an inoculant. If you want your compost to do something specific, that's when it gets specific. Generally, though, what you are looking for is either bacterially dominated or fungally dominated. If you are talking about like a specific type of compost, and that's where like all the recipes and everything come on. And I'm just going to talk about this real quick because it's not like, we don't need to get too deep into this, but just if you're wondering why there's different recipes and things, this is why. Those specific ratios that people will give you where they're like, oh, you need 2 parts this, 1 part this, or 1 part this, 2 parts this, and 3 parts this. Those are ratios that are designed to minimize turning in the compost, like that you won't need to be turning it or aerating it as often, which can be helpful, especially if you're wanting to create a fungally dominated compost, which is what's best for like trees or perennials. However, again, if you are just looking to reduce waste and not necessarily and make some fertilizer, but not like to make a real specific compost to like create a specific soil environment kind of thing, then you don't need to worry about that. But again, just in case you're curious, if you want a bacterially dominated compost, that is where you're adding more greens, and it's turned more often. So the more greens and the more often it is turned, the more bacterially dominated your compost will be. Vermicompost is probably the easiest way to get a high quality bacterially dominated compost, just because the guts of worms are pretty much all bacteria. So their poop, which is what vermicompost is basically a rich diversity of bacteria that is great. Tumbling is another way to get a good bacterially dominated compost, because you're aerating it a lot. There's not going to be a lot of fungal populations in there. And then commercial, just the way that our health and safety laws work, which is important, so that our compost that we buy at the store doesn't have E. coli and stuff in it. But in order to do that, the way that the laws are written, it has to be turned a lot. So commercial compost is pretty much all bacterially dominated. So bacterially dominated compost is pretty easy to get. It's really the fungally dominated compost that is more difficult. And that is where those specific ratios come in again. So if you want to make that, there's a couple kind of easier ways to do it than just those very specific ratios. So one is to let a finished pile sit. So if you make, a bunch of compost in your tumbling or vermicompost or something, and then you let it sit for like 6 months, it will become more fungally dominated. You'll get more fungus growing in it, but it's the turning is damaging to fungus. So if you just let it sit, it will do that. Also, if you add liquid fish to a finished pile, just something about the structure of those fish proteins, bacteria can't really break it down, but fungi can. And so that also can help kind of increase the fungal population. Or you can do like a static pile, which is just piling stuff up and not turning it. But if you want to do that, you would have to add a lot of chimneys to make sure you're still getting oxygen without turning it. So those are the ways to get fungally dominated compost if you're looking at doing that. If you're wanting to try your hand at making fungally dominated compost, the best idea is to get as much diversity of browns as you can. So things like wood chips, and ideally from multiple species. Fall leaves, again, from multiple species. Straw, dead plants from the garden, roadside, forest, etc. And then fish waste. So liquid fish, or fish guts if you're a fisherman or something like that. Mix it all together, wet it, pile it up, punch chimneys in it, and wait. And when I say wait, I'm talking like let it sit for like a full year. And that's how you would get fungally dominated compost, which is going to be the best compost, again, for like trees, shrubs, like woody perennials especially are going to really like a fungally dominated compost. But that being said, any compost is good for your plants. You don't have to worry about, oh, is it fungally dominated or not? But just if you're curious, that's a quick intro to those fungal versus bacterially dominated. And yeah, that is composting 101. I hope that was a good kind of intro, answers some of your basic questions. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you all might have.